So we've got all DNOs in the room, that's what we're hoping for. We've also got Mark from Ofgem, a key stakeholder in the process of looking at value of lost load and the overall ED2 process that has just kicked off recently with Ofgem's letter. Impact's part in this market research company. They've been doing some work with us, collecting data about individual customers' views of Voll, and Fraser Nash are a new partner in this project, this work of Voll, who've been now doing a piece of work for us, trying to transform our, we've got a lot of data about Voll. In fact, I would say, I think we found ourselves with more data perhaps than we think we could practically make use of in setting and using Voll within industry frameworks, because there's quite a high level, very simplistic use of Voll within ED2 frameworks at present. And so what we realised is we need to move, especially with the ED2 timescales now being pressing in terms of developing frameworks, towards finding the right sweet spot between the level of detail of Voll that we've got and something that is going to be practically applicable to the regulatory frameworks that we all use and the ingredients that we put into our business plans. I just wanted to reflect a bit on the ED2 open letter, because that's quite key for us, and Voll's one of the things that we see in Electricity North West as, we call it a big idea. It's an area that we've been working on for some time, where we think there's actually genuine scope to improve the outcomes for customers if we were to think of Voll in a different way to it's been traditionally used within the ED2 framework. The open letter highlights, it's under the strategic investment part, but Voll's fundamental to a lot of what we do in electricity distribution. But under the strategic investment part in the open letter, Ofgem quotes the National Infrastructure Commission, the Committee on Climate Change and Sustainability First, and all of those organisations talk about having some way of of making networks ready, basically ready for the decarbonised, decentralised and digitised future that's ahead of us. And when we get into the meat of today's session, what hopefully you'll see is that we've got different Volls for different types of customers. So in a world where there are multiple customers, all with electric vehicles or low carbon generation technologies, or customers in vulnerable circumstances, they've got a different Voll to the average. And what we're thinking is that you can plan your investments with a monetised measure of benefit that is potentially forward-looking. And that will go to some of those points that are made by the National Infrastructure, the Cabinet Committee on Climate Change and Sustainability First, who are all saying, as key stakeholders, that that's the direction that they want to see the regulatory framework moving. So this is, at the moment, it's in Electricity Northwest, one of our big ideas for a potential change. It's been openly developed as a network innovation allowance project with lots of information shared with other companies. But what we're trying to explore today is what level of consensus, if any, is there across other network companies for a consistent way of using Voll as we go into that ED2 phase. And by the time we get to the end of today's session, we're hoping we've got the right people here through the discussion to give us a sense of is this an area that your company is interested in collaborating on with us as Electricity Northwest moving forward on how Voll can be used in the future regulatory framework. We think it's got advantages if we all use Voll in the same way as electricity distribution companies, or certainly apply the same principles. So out of today's session, we're looking to get a sense of where do we go from here. Is this something that sits in the Electricity Northwest world that we develop with our partners and present as part of our future business plan, or is this something that there's scope to collaborate more widely on with other DNOs? So we're wrestling, I think, and you'll see through the presentation, with the classical issue of how much complexity do we introduce into how Voll's used versus how practical that might be within our DNO businesses. And then we've also got a tension with some sense of accuracy and the practicality again of how our business works and where the optionality of where individual investments might be made, and how you can practically take into account, say, a level of Voll that could theoretically be at individual household level, or it could be at a regional level, or it could be at a national level, as it is today. It could be today's Voll, it could be the Voll for 10 years' time, 20 years' time, 50 years' time, if there's a way to forecast that. And those are some of the big questions for today's session. We want to learn from shared experience, so we're hoping that people who've come along today, if you were doing work within your own companies or were aware of other stakeholders' work on Voll, that you'd be in a position to share that. So that's a key thing from today, because we're very conscious that other companies might have already been thinking about some of these issues as part of their work, and we'd obviously like to bring that out in this session and find the best way forward, if possible, for the industry as a whole. So that's what today is about. And before we get into the meat of it, are there any questions around the room as to what we're trying to achieve and the journey that we want to go on through, the agenda that we've got? No. So
everyone's in the right meeting.
Everyone's in the right meeting. That's great. Thank you very much for the journey to see us today. It wouldn't be the Northwest if it wasn't raining with it. So without further ado, we'll get on to the meat of the session, and I'll hand back to Tracy.
Thanks, Paul. Right, I'm sure that on the various working groups that you sit, that this slide will be quite familiar to you. So I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time actually going over the granular details of our findings, but I will give you the highlights just for those that are unfamiliar. So Voll historically was developed in the concept of Voll in the early 1990s on decentralisation. It represents the average cost that electricity customers would, they value the security of the supply, and it effectively acts as a price signal for how much the industry should invest to deliver security of supply. As I say, it's existed since the 1990s. The last major study for Voll was conducted, it was commissioned by Ofgem, a company called London Economics. They estimated an average Voll of £17,000 per megawatt hour for all customers across GB, with the exception of large industrial and commercial customers. Now, they did sample industrial and commercial customers, and what they established is that Voll within that group varied significantly, as it does within the domestic and the SME group, small to medium enterprise, I'm sure all that. But because they are better able to articulate their price signal and have got better resilience strategies, the Voll of the I and C group was never actually factored into this overall value. So again, it varies considerably within the range, and it is very much influenced by seasonality, time of day, type of customer, rurality, social economic groups. Voll critically is the single average, so it has no reflection of diversity, and that is the crux of why we're actually here today. Whilst London Economic Study valued it at £17,000 per megawatt hour, Ofgem used a slightly lower figure, and that relates to the transmission sector as well, of £16 per megawatt hour for ED1. So, the Voll study, the original Voll research, which started out largely, not necessarily, but largely as a piece of customer work to basically go out across GB and to see whether or not the existing values remain constant or whether there have been fluctuation, and critically to establish what the true impact of lost load was on a very diverse group of customers. We work very closely with our market research partners, Impact Research. We've got Dawn and David here today. And they, if anybody's got any questions about the particular modelling that they use, they will be able to talk at length on that subject. One of the other factors was, again, Voll is an expression of the social and the financial cost of lost load to customers. But again, it's that one single average that's used at the moment. One of the key concepts of the Voll research was to ascertain how that varied by customer type. Now, we have got a plethora of data, masses of data, as to how that varies. You've got a very, very high-level summary fact sheet on your desk that gives to us those high-level findings. So I don't propose within this discussion to go into those granular variations. But suffice to say that customers that are on low incomes, in fuel poverty, and are vulnerable, once you have made a few adjustments to reflect income, have a significantly higher Voll than the average, and that reflects that these customers are significantly more impacted by power supply than the average. And we're finding exactly the same for our early adopters of LCT, who again are significantly impacted. One of the research outputs was how does Voll vary by supply interruption components, so frequency and duration of outages. And again, we have tested this as far as we are conceivably able to test. One of the additional pieces of research that we did, an add-on to these key factors, if you will, was can you possibly mitigate the value of lost load in an unplanned supply interruption by providing additional support, enhanced communication, enhanced services to customers. And so there's some really quite interesting findings around that. Again, the highlights are in the report. Basically, a lot of it is what we already know. Customers really, really appreciate understanding what's going on. Largely, they want to know what's happened, why they're off supply, when they're going to be back on, what we're going to do about it, and that came across in this research. A telephone call to customers that are affected by a fault was the best way of actually mitigating the impact. And again, we've touched on how Voll is going to change in relation to LCT adoption. This was a really, really challenging piece of the research. As I say, we conducted research with about 6,500 customers across GB. That, by anybody's reckoning, is a huge survey. We went GB-wide, so we were able to reflect the entire populace. Again, primarily domestic customers, 5,000 plus domestic customers, but we had a big sample of SME customers. So we feel that we've got some really robust findings. The findings that we've got have subsequently been validated, so we are quite happy based on the research and the methodologies that we have used that actually represent the truth. One of the real issues that we had was how you understand or how you try to assess Voll in a low carbon future. And we conducted a huge pilot survey, a good, that's about 600, was 500, 600, surveys just in the pilot to test what was a very complicated survey to ascertain whether or not customers were able to appropriately respond to that, they were able to understand it, and actually to test the views and the reactions. What became apparent in this survey is that the customers that aren't adopters of low carbon technologies and perhaps don't have that understanding, it's really, really difficult for them to be able to project what the impact of a low carbon future might be. So on that basis, we had to carry out a few adjustments to the research methodology. And what we actually did is we only sampled customers that were adopters, so EV users, heat pump users, PV users, on the basis that they were a true reflection of the future scenario and best able to respond. So I'll let this build. Again, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail, but what I can say is that this is the results of the survey that we had. When you look at all the granular details and you aggregate them up, these are the findings that we found. So for domestic customers, we have got an average fall of £17,500 per megawatt hour. For our commercial, small to medium enterprise customers, as you'd expect, that is higher, so that came in at 47.5. And when you combine that Voll in a weighted fashion in exactly the same way that London Economics did, the Voll for the average Voll for customers using the same protocol as London Economics is around about £7,000 higher than the last study, so we can see that it has increased significantly. Now, again, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about the methodology. Suffice to say that it was very, very robust, peer-reviewed, tested. There are quite a number of ways that you can measure Voll, and we replicated the way that London Economics have done it because that had been endorsed previously by Ofgem. We used a conjoined stated preference survey, which appears to be the very best way of doing it. There are other methods of survey that are available to test that. There are other modelling approaches, but the consensus is that the way that we have the methodology is by far and away the best way to assess Voll. Just in terms of the values that we've quoted here as well, so I've talked about the stated preference conjoint survey exercise that we used. We tested both willingness to accept compensation for a supply interruption and willingness to pay to avoid a supply interruption, and again used exactly the same protocol that Ofgem has used. The willingness to accept payment in compensation for a supply interruption always will come out higher than the willingness to pay, and there are reasons for that we have articulated in the comprehensive phase 3 report. But again, it replicates the protocol that London Economics used. You've probably all seen this very, very simplistic slide, but it does what it says on the tin. And basically, very, very simplistic view of two comparable feeders with a very, very small number of customers, 50 customers each on here. And we've just broken down the top feeder. You can see we've got urban households and we've got small users. And the numbers are stated underneath that, compared with a rural feeder where we have got a proportion of customers in fuel poverty and we've got some early adopters of electric vehicles. We did a piece of analysis and we looked at the 10-year fault level where we had a fault once every 5 years over a 40-year period. The net present value, if you use the current method, is £72,000 for each of those feeders. It's exactly the same. If you introduced 50 customers that were all SMEs and they were residential, light industrial users, that all would be exactly the same. If you use the new Voll and the new analytics, it's quite clear that there is a much lower Voll than the average on the top feeder. However, the bottom feeder is significantly underrepresented, and this just very clearly, in a nutshell, just helps to demonstrate how that more granular understanding and that customer dimension of Voll potentially leads to far better and much more nuanced investment decisions. Okay, so just a summary of some of the key highlights. I've already mentioned that Voll is increasing considerably over time. We developed a statistical model to try and develop the granular impacts of an interruption. It was very much a prototype model that we tried to use to actually to apply how you would develop Voll and calculate Voll for complex households. It was very much a challenge, and we found that if you start to use more than two characteristics, so for example, a household where we have customers in the age of 30 to 44 that are EV users, you start to introduce more elements, more components, and it becomes less stable. And this is the basis of Voll 2, where we've engaged Fraser Nash, and they will talk about that in more detail. One of the critical things to understand about our piece of research and the London Economics piece of research is, I talked about the pilot, and the pilot demonstrated just how difficult a concept this is to introduce to customers and then to get the appropriate response. We introduced time of day for outages, so we tested a range of time of day outages, and we introduced seasonality. London Economics had tested a range of outages, so they had looked at, they'd asked respondents about scenarios that involve winter and summer, peak and non-peak. When we did this with the range of attributes that we were testing, the results that we got back were really unstable. Customers found it extraordinarily difficult to match off one scenario against the other, because the range of components that we were testing was just too complicated for them to get their heads around, and that became quite clear from the pilot. On that basis, we asked the respondents to specify what would be the worst time that you could experience a power cut that would be most inconvenient to your business or your household, and to respond to the questions in that vein. So rather than the average Voll, we are conscious that the values that we have developed are the worst case scenario. However, we feel that that is appropriate because that's actually the true scenario. Customers will be responding in relative to the time that is most inconvenient to them. The higher Voll estimates that we also received also potentially reflect to some degree the attributes that are tested. So London Economics based the frequency of interruption as once every 12 years, and that was based on some modelling that DEC had done for the estimated level of supply interruption in the period that this research was conducted. Now, we did some research to find out what the average CI and CML rate was across GB, and we looked at our own, and we felt that it would be more appropriate to root the survey in reality. So we tested Voll once every 3 years, which is more realistic than once every 12 years, but that could have had an impact on slightly pushing up the values. Okay, again, I'm not going to talk at length, but what we did do is we tested across a range of frequency and durations, and this just gives you some indication. If you notice here, the values that I've quoted for domestic customer are for the willingness to accept compensation for one outage every 3 years, and that is exactly the same for the SME group. But you can see that we've tested a range of outages and increased frequency. It's really quite interesting. As you'd expect, the Voll for customers rises significantly the longer that supply interruption lasts. However, in terms of our high impact, low probability outages, you find that that upward trajectory starts to actually tail off, where customers really start, we think, to develop their own resilience strategies and the mentality of, you know, we're all in it together. One extra hour actually becomes no more significant. As I say, the Voll findings that we've had, the granular findings, have been disseminated at length. There is a huge amount of information that we have published on the Voll website. I will share these slides with you, so all the information you'll be able to access from that. The interim findings we disseminated at the LCNI conference in Telford. They have been disseminated at the NOMS cross-sector working group. We had an innovation and learning event where we invited all our stakeholders to attend in Manchester in 2018, and the project was disseminated while I was there. Been presented to our various advisory panels, and on the basis of the feedback that we've got from the advisory panels, we have proceeded with the Voll 2 research. And again, I'm looking around here, obviously we've got a lot of members of the Reliability, Safety and Environment Working Group, and I know that Jonathan has been speaking at Voll in that particular forum. Presented again at the LCNI in October 2018, and the LCNI have asked us to speak about Voll again this year because it's a project of interest to them. We've actually even been speaking to the Australian regulator about Voll, haven't they? They've expressed an interest in terms of understanding our methodology because they are now reviewing their particular framework. I think I've touched on these really, but we'll just cover them off again. The existing approach undervalues the needs of certain customer types, there's no diversity, and it's not reflective of LCT. The fuel poor groups I mentioned are hugely underrepresented, and their Voll, before you adjust it for income, is about 25% higher than the average. When you adjust for income, the value of loss load to the fuel poor is about 90% higher than the average, and there's obvious reasons for that. These customers just don't have the resilience strategies to be able to manage a supply interruption, and they struggle to deal with the consequences of a supply interruption after the event. If they've lost the freezer contents, that's potentially their income for the week gone. We feel that a segmented model would enable the ENOs to make decisions that are much more reflective of customer needs. We feel that this is attractive because we are not fundamentally looking to change any of the existing regulatory models, but we're just hoping that we can enhance it with this more nuanced customer understanding. And a revised model will provide an effective tool that DNOs can use without a huge amount of additional data flows, and there is an awful lot of information out there that we can potentially use in the build, but I'm not going to steal Fraser Nash's thunder. Takes us on to Voll 2. I'll just very, very briefly talk about Voll 2. Again, it's been endorsed by our stakeholder panels. In the conclusions of the analysis, we realised that there were some questions that we hadn't been able to answer. I talked before about the complexities of applying Voll for complex households. And we recognise, whilst you've got the impact, have got huge analytical skills, that this actually needed another organisation that worked in this particular field to support us. And we also felt that that was necessary to actually validate the findings as well. And as such, we've brought Fraser Nash on board, and you've joined us through a competitive tender process. Fraser Nash will be talking about how we can establish the optimum degree of complexity in a new model, how we can apply that, whether that is at connection point by MPAN or by feeder, by secondary, by primary up to GB level, over what time should Voll be considered, and I know that Paul has just touched on this. This is a real fundamental, so we've measured today's Voll, and we have measured predicted increases with LCT. You know, is that accurate? Is that going to change? What is a Voll in 10 or 20 years' time? And how is that going to reflect in some of the important decisions that we make today in terms of our investment? We also need to establish the stability and the variability of factors that influence a Voll, and the level of detail at which these can be combined, and I've mentioned before, and how we can actually apply these within the constraints of our parameters. And what is in the art of the possible in terms of developing a tool with the data and the systems that we have, that all the NOs have, and we were very, whilst we have got a lot of variables that are in the Voll mix that will not be data that is readily available to the NOs, such as the age profile of households, that information theoretically is available externally, but what we have tried to do is to root the key Voll drivers in information that is going to be readily available, not just to Electricity North West, but commonly to all the NOs. So that's the crux of today's session. Just so as you are aware, in tandem with this, we have got another element of the Voll study, and Impact are working very closely on us with this. There were some unanswered questions in terms of the Voll related to frequency and duration. So I showed you a slide earlier, and it shows that upward trajectory for all planned outages. We did test actually planned outages as well, but as you'd expect, period of notice actually significantly drives their Voll, until you get to a point where customers are experiencing a lot of unplanned outages. So it starts to demonstrate actually in terms of how we structure our maintenance programs. There is Voll certainly comes into play because it reflects customers' acceptability of work that is required to maintain our network. What we also, Voll was measured as it has to be measured by the individual. So it was the individual's view and their responses to a set number of scenarios, or a mixed number of scenarios that were provided, but nevertheless it is the individual's view. So in terms of what Voll might mean at a community level, particularly when we start to talk about high impact, low probability events, how do you start to extrapolate these individual Voll measurements to reflect the actual view of the community? And that is a piece of work that we are looking at. So we developed a survey to look at what we've referred to as the Voll modifier in terms of scale and duration. So that's more the technical customer investigation that we're doing, but we also want to try and understand customers' perception, again across a range of customers, about their views in terms of equity and fairness and what their perceptions are about that. So we understand from a network perspective that we are going to have to invest significantly in areas where we have got a huge uptake of LCT, but it goes without question. However, how do you start to balance that in terms of investment in areas where we have got a significant amount of fuel poverty and customers that are likely to be left behind? So these are slightly intangible questions, but we will throw those into the mix at the end of the day, just to deliver what our customers' view is in terms of those perception measures.
It's charging review, so I think I heard that down there. So it's basically our sort of input we're planning to make to the charging review, because who pays? You could target the price of distribution based on people's Voll to some extent and their ability to pay.
Yeah, we've been out, we've done a piece of work already with the focus group, and we've again, very, very difficult concept for customers to try and understand, but we've actually started to float about the socialisation of costs and, and general perceptions to that. And again, just finally, we also want to try and get an assessment of what the unintended customer consequences might be of a functional variable Voll model. So those reports, we have a survey that is in development stage, and we will be reporting on those findings early into next year. So thank you very much. Oh, just in terms of the timeline, yeah, from the timeline that I'm showing you here is very much the strategic practical implementation piece. As you can see, we've got some really, really tight timelines. We will be presenting Voll at the LCNI. Fraser Nash will be developing a visualisation tool to support us in that, and their recommendations in how we take this forward are going to be due towards the end of October, early November. And we would, at the end of this session, we'll talk about that later, like to give all the panel members the opportunity of contributing. The project will actually close down in May 2020 when the full suite of final reports will be delivered. I'm going to hand you over to Jonathan now, who will talk about where Voll sits within the current regulatory mechanism. Thank you, Jonathan.
Right, good morning everyone. That's not bad. If you were back at school, the teacher would make you do that again. So that's how I work. This is the last sort of contextual piece from me before we sort of perhaps get started on wider discussions and explore with Fraser Nash sort of how we take this forward. And what I'm just going to do is explore a little bit about how Voll is currently used within the regulatory framework, because it is one of those, it is a cornerstone of a number of the key pieces of the RIIO framework. It's we were having a discussion the other day, and it's one of those things where when you scratch beneath the surface, if the sector has a magic number, the equivalent of 42 is actually £16,000 per kilowatt hour. So we were just going to have a quick look at where Voll is currently used, because obviously this sets the context for how we might take it forward and use it in the future. Because given the timeframes we're looking at for RIIO-2, we have to be sort of deeply practical and pragmatic about what the art of the possible is here. As has been explained, we've got a massive empirical research which has explored all kinds of interesting vectors of customer sensitivity. But part of what our challenge is to boil that down into something that's perhaps workable and practical, and we can perhaps all take away and use within RIIO-2. So what we're going to have a very quick look at on the left-hand side of this slide are the three areas we've identified where Voll is effectively already hardwired into the regulatory mechanism. So they are respectively setting the IAS incentive rates that we know and love, their input into the cost-benefit analysis model that was used extensively at the time of the ED1 submissions, but also has an ongoing function in some of our regulatory reporting requirements, where we're looking at sort of reporting innovation and so on, and also the role of Voll in the common network asset indices methodology, which is the asset risk measurement approach that we take. Conscious that various colleagues around the room have been deeply involved in parts of this, so apologies if I strangle anything in translation, but I'll try and cover them all. We did also note on here the fact that we do have the worst served customer regime, which is something that the Reliability, Safety and Environment Working Group has reminded itself it needs to think about. That doesn't use Voll explicitly, but it does have a fiscal hurdle in it, where there is a sort of an expenditure limit per customer that is eligible under that particular mechanism. So it's a sort of like an early version of perhaps using a different Voll for a different customer segment. It's not expressed in those terms, but there's something there. And at the moment, Voll isn't explicitly used to set other customer parameters, such as the guaranteed standards regime or the CSAT process. Whether it should or shouldn't is perhaps a point for future discussion. So just tripping through the three on the left-hand side very briefly. IAS, and I know there are colleagues around the room who are deeply versed in all of this, but you have to translate this £16,000 figure into the marginal incentive rates that appear in your license. So in each of the charge restriction conditions of your licenses, there will be a couple of magic numbers, which are your CI and CML rates, which are on the left-hand side. But to get to those, you have to start with the 16,000 and go through a process, which involves some of the assumptions on the right-hand side, such as what average domestic consumption is, for example. And through that, you can convert a Voll factor into a per minute factor, and then you can translate that back into your CI and CML factors that you see in your license. And as you can see on the left-hand side, because all our networks are of different sizes, if you have a relatively small number of customers, our colleagues in SSEH towards the bottom have the lowest marginal rate numbers, and our colleagues in EPN have the highest numbers, but they are all ultimately rooted in the same value. But in order to do that, you have to put this logic train in place to sort of calculate how you translate from value of loss load to a CI and CML rate. Once you've done that, once you've broken it into a value of an interruption and a value of a minute, you've now got two parameters that you can use for other investment assessment and analysis. I'll skip over CBRM. And the two that we look at particularly are the Common Network Asset Indices methodology and the CBA model. Now, in some respects, these slides are the wrong way around because the chronology is slightly different. But the Common Network Asset Indices methodology is a consistent way that's applied across the sector to evaluate the risk of assets, the condition-based risk of assets. And in order to evaluate the risk, you have to look at the probability of a condition-based failure and the consequence of that failure. And in assessing the consequence, in order to have a consistent approach across the whole sector, there are 4 key parameters that are used so that we can all assess the consequence of any asset failure in exactly the same way. So they are an assessment of the financial consequences of that asset failing, the safety consequences, the environmental consequences, and importantly for this debate, the network performance or customer impacts. So if an asset fails, that may or may not cause an interruption. How do you value the impact of that interruption on the customers that have been affected? Well, you've got the answer because it's already written into your license in terms of your IIS rates. So one of the neat things about the Common Network Asset Indices methodology is it just borrows the same factors that are used for IIS and uses those as its risk factors for network performance. So there's a consistency there. We're using the same parameters and they're calibrated exactly the same way. There is two things just to note on this. One, that's a relatively easy thing to do at LV and HV, where you have a fault, an interruption results, customers observe an interruption and you can value it. What the Common Network Asset Indices methodology has to think about, in particular, is what happens when you have faults on an N-1 network, where you can have a fault, but actually there may not be an observable interruption. And what CNAME does is it mimics the effect of if the redundancy wasn't in place. Otherwise, it runs the risk of not valuing that redundancy and hence not replacing that redundancy when the time comes. And the way it does it, which is sort of the graphic on the right-hand side, is it has to look at how much load is at risk over what time frame of the fault. And there are many pages in the methodology itself which look at things like possibility of coincident fault and so on and so forth. So it tries to put a level playing field in place, that whether you're talking about an LV pole or a piece of 132 kV switchgear, you're basically using the same calibrated impacts of network performance failure. Interestingly, just the bottom box on here, just a quick sidebar, CNAME already sort of knows it has to think about a variable vol, but doesn't really know how to do it. So CNAME already includes something called a customer sensitivity factor, which effectively is a dial bolted onto the right-hand side of the machine that says if you've got a particular circumstance for the asset you're thinking about, where those customers, if those customers are affected by a fault, it's not vanilla vol, it's something different, then there is a dial that you can turn that actually changes the strength of that factor. It is simply, I always visualize it as a big dial that calibrates from 1 to 2. That's what CNAME allows you to do. You can basically turn it up a bit, or you can leave it where it is set at 1. CNAME doesn't know under what circumstances you would apply it, and it doesn't know what evidence you would supply to prove it. But there is a hook within the methodology already that acknowledges the fact that you may have some assets where the impacts of failure on the customer supplied by those assets may well be different from the norm.
Can you turn it down a bit?
No, you can't. You're not allowed to at the moment, based on my check on methodology this morning, but I'm sure Bob will correct me if I'm...
No, you're quite right, the minimum scoring. In ED1.
In ED1. That's it.
ED1, yeah.
This is purely an ED,
Oh,
yeah, this is
good.
just how it is today.
ED2 is tomorrow.
The last part of this, the third sort of key framework in which Voll has a current function is the cost-benefit analysis. And one of the neat things about the ED sector, and we really only realised this when we were having conversations with gas and transmission, is that our CNAME methodology, the risk factors we talked about are actually just the other side of the coin of the benefits in the CBA model. So the CBA, if you have an investment that you're trying to assess, when you look at the potential value of that assessment, you have to characterise it in terms of its financial impact, its network performance impact, its safety impact, and its environmental impact. Sound familiar? It's designed to be so because CNAME uses exactly the same parameters but just flips them over. So the benefits in your CBA model are the risks in your CNAME model, which is a fantastic piece of integrity that actually we realised other sectors don't have because they have different frameworks for both sides of that, or they certainly did in their real analysis. So when you use a CBA and you're doing a CBA model, you again are simply importing the same CI and CML factors that were calculated in the IAS rates. A fixed static value that ultimately roots itself back in that magic number of 16,000 kilowatt hours. And that has been set as a fixed parameter within the CBA model. There will be undoubtedly a whole discussion, I think, I'm not sure if it merits probably its own working group about development of the CBA model. All the parameters in there, from my recollection, are fixed with the exception of one on carbon intensity, which does change through time. But one of the questions that we will be asking is to say, actually, for concepts like Voll, when you're thinking about long life investments, should you be considering the Voll today, or should you be considering the Voll over some longer term period, either the period of the life of the asset, or the period of your CBA analysis, or some other factor? Again, really interested in views when we perhaps sort of open up the discussion a bit later. Worst served customers, I haven't found anybody who's a fan of the current mechanism, either in the Ofgem side or the DNO side. It was introduced as a slight counterweight to the IAS scheme. So what the IAS scheme does is it drives you to improve performance where it's most economic to do so. Now that might be to make the performance of the service provided to customers that already get a good service even better. It doesn't necessarily mean you go and improve the service for those who receive the worst amount, because it may well be quite a costly intervention to do so. So the worst served customer regime was introduced in DPCR 5 actually as a bit of a add-on, a counterweight to the IAS, but it's a very complex regime with a fiscal hurdle, an improvement hurdle, a logging up regime, etc., and you have to wait for your customers to qualify as worst served before you can do anything about it. So it doesn't actually allow any form of proactive intervention. It's very reactive. However, what it does do is set a precedent in the regulatory framework for doing something different for a particular group of customers who, by virtue of the performance that they receive, perhaps deserve a different approach or merit a different approach on this. So one of the unanswered questions that we had in ED1, and again, my view is we simply timed out on worst served customers because it wasn't too material a thing, is finding a replacement for the current regime that's workable into Rio 2, and whether that includes a form of Voll analysis within it. The one exception, and perhaps the one precedent that we do have, SSE did do something different for ED1 for Highlands and Islands, which was a different proposal. So it's, again, worst served customers is definitely something that we will need to come back to at some point, and it may well be that Voll has a place in that debate. So that's all I was going to do in terms of a recap. I think that seems to general nodding around the room that that's sort of where we're at today. Sets the base for how we might think about application into Rio 2, which is just a little bit of time, Mark, if you're okay for a couple of minutes on Ofgem perspective.
Yeah.
Go for the first break.
Please, yeah.
I think you have to sit in the hot seat.
Do I have to go there? Okay. So, too much to say, unfortunately. Yeah, that's good. Thanks so much. I just like to thank you, EWL, for kicking off this study in 2018. I think we were presented to in our cost visit last year. There's a kind of already kind of taken kind of comprehensive study by that stage already, and developing some legs to kind of move forward for this year. I think, just as Jonathan's gone through just then, I think even if we just roll forward with ED1 into ED2, we'd have to do quite a lot of work, and having thoughts of where we want to go with Voll, just to update the current framework. And I think you all know we've got our open letter out there at the moment. It's not got to that kind of detailed, granular level that we'll be looking for in next year's consultation methodology, but we're very welcome to any thoughts early on of kind of where you believe Ofgem should be taking these sort of key parts of the framework. So in our open letter that's currently out there, open letter consultation, we're kind of looking at some of the key framework issues at the moment, but we kind of want to lock in to start really moving forward with ED2. But very welcome for any early thoughts, and I know you'll be feeding back to EWL, but anything you have that we'd like to share with ourselves, we'd be very keen to know. So just in terms of our process, kind of our open letter consultation closes out on October the 15th, so we look forward to all responses. Following that, within the next few weeks actually, you'll have details of some of the kind of key working groups, and I know we've kicked off some early working groups thinking about these sort of things under quality of service, and particularly in kind of CNAME working groups, and trying to think about some of the kind of requirements under flexibility capacity. But you'll have a bit more details about where we're going to be taking the ED2 working groups in the next couple of weeks, particularly picking up key themes like this. So we've got a new outputs framework in Rio 2. We'll be aligning our working groups more so with those key outputs. Reliability and safety will still be a key factor in that, is one of the key outputs, and we would definitely expect to have quite a lot of working groups over the next kind of 12 months, possibly to kind of inform our sector methodologies next summer. So very much welcome any thoughts ourselves, and thank you again EWL for kicking this off, and we look forward to engaging ourselves Ofgem, because as we know how important this figure is for the price control.
So yeah, you'll have some handouts in front of you, and just walk around and print out the slides that we're going to be going through over the next half hour, 45 minutes or so. There's also some slides for you to make notes on at the end. We printed a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. As we get towards the back end of the presentation, we think there are various options or ideas we've had for how we could progress this study, and to make this a slightly more active session. As we're going through that, you can make notes. We think that will feed into the discussion at the end. So, quick introduction. So we've been tasked by Electricity North West, as introduced by Tracy, to explore the implementation of a segmented Voll network, that Voll model, commencing the work in August, so just a couple of months ago. So this workshop is really an industry consultation on the work we've done to date, and the ideas we have for how a segmented model could be implemented. The reason for gathering everyone here today is really to share our proposed approach and get feedback on it, explore the practicalities of how you might implement a more disaggregated model, and how it might impact the investment decision models and regulatory incentive schemes that Jonathan, I thought, did a very good job of explaining very succinctly just now. And discussing and sharing best practice, as Tracy said. There might be other work going on in this area that we're not aware of, and this would be an excellent forum to share that. You're aware of it. So an agenda, I'm going to be talking first through the modelling approach that we're embarking on. Spent kind of half the time kind of going through that, and then the second half, first half's really giving the context, and the second part is, right, we've got to the point where we've got various options here about how we can proceed, and it's not for us to say what the best option is going to be for the industry. So presenting those options and facilitating a discussion about what the best way forwards might be. So we've come up with a number of different options for ideas for how we might want to proceed, but I think I'd kind of say these are starting points. It's not an exhaustive list. It's got to be one of these options, and it may be through kind of a creative discussion we have today, we come up with some blend or a new idea that might be the best way to proceed. So that will then lead into the open discussion that we're having after lunch. Last, as I'm going through the approach, we hold questions until the end. So I imagine this will probably then get into hopefully quite an interesting and detailed discussion. So this has been covered in the first part of the plenary session, but to quickly give context on our starting point for the work, our data set is the customer survey that was conducted by Impact Research, which looked to calculate a Voll value using choice experiment data. So customers were presented with trade-off scenarios such as the one on the slide and asked to select the option that most accurately reflected their view of the payment they would expect to receive in such a situation. And it's the willingness to accept values that were taken forward as opposed to willingness to pay. 6,500 customers were surveyed, including 5,000 domestic customers and 1,500 SME customers. And then hierarchical phase analysis used to calculate a Voll. Some terminology. Voll indicators are the characteristics that can be identified for a customer that might mean that they have a different Voll from the average fixed Voll that is currently being applied nationwide. And we've been able to use the customer survey data, and Impact Research did some additional analysis on that survey data to analyse how Voll varied by customer segment. So the survey catalogues whether the respondent was a domestic customer or SME, their age, gender, morality, income, vulnerability, fuel poverty, consumption, reliability, so have they experienced power cuts before, whether or not they're on the gas network, and whether or not they're adopters of low carbon technology. An analysis of the survey results, as is actually in the handout, that Electricity North West have provided, can allow you to determine what are the most significant indicators of Voll. And the figure on the right hand side there is a heat map of where the respondents to the survey are based, so kind of showing good nationwide coverage. This wasn't just a survey conducted in the North West region. So, getting into a bit of the technical detail, this is a simplified example I would flag up front. We're not just considering EV ownership and morality, but for the purposes of explaining the key factors in the model, it's worth simplifying it right down. So Voll can be estimated for the entire survey population, so that big blob of people in the middle is the entire survey population, and for all 6,500 customers or 5,000 domestic customers, it's possible to use the results of the customer survey to estimate a value of Voll, and that is the 17,500 figure and the 47,500 figure for domestic and SME customers respectively, that have been discussed already. It's also possible to break the survey data down into respondents with specific attributes and calculate Voll for just those customer segments. So whilst we have 5,000 domestic customers, of those 2,000 live in a rural area, so it's possible to just analyse the respondents that live in a rural area and calculate a Voll for those customers. You can then break it down further and say, what about people who live in rural areas who own EVs or are fuel poor and calculate a Voll for the 500 customers who fit that criteria. You can imagine that as you continue doing that, you actually very quickly get to a point where you've got too many features, a dimensionality problem, and you can't analyse the data any further. You need a huge amount of data to be able to break it down into a household that actually in reality reflects a real household in the UK. So that's the complex household problem that Tracy alluded to earlier, is how do you calculate a Voll for someone who lives in a rural area, is EV owning, is age 35 to 49. It very quickly becomes impossible unless you have a vast data set. So what can you do about that? Well, I think the reality is that you don't actually need to estimate the Voll for an individual customer. You only need to calculate a Voll for a sample population or a group of customers, perhaps served by a distribution substation. And so the approach that we've embarked on is to sample that survey data a large number of times to create these sample populations that, taking this rurality and EV owning example, we're able to calculate the Voll for a rural area with 5% of EV owners, or a rural area with 10% of EV owners, or a rural area with 20% of EV owners. The same thing for an urban area. By that way, with 6,500 customer surveys completed, if you do the permutation analysis, there's billions and billions of different sample populations you can create using that data. So that is the analysis that we've got crunching away, is to calculate the Voll for those different customer segments and populations that are more representative of a real population. So the key thing here is then that the model can be used for any sample population for which you know the Voll indicators. So again, the simple example, you may know the Voll from your survey data of an urban area with 10% EV owners and 15% EV owners. You don't have the survey data to back up 12% EV owning, but using the model and training that model on the survey data, you can create a model which is able to make that prediction. So for example, you could predict the Voll for a population within a lower super alpha area, which is a fixed geographic area of approximately 1,500 residents, or you could estimate the Voll for the area around the substation or the household served by a particular asset. So the problem then comes from, okay, we've got this model that if you feed it the Voll indicators, it can predict a value for Voll. The next question is, how do you calculate those Voll indicators? We are currently still down selecting which Voll indicators are the most important. Obviously, a key thing for this study is taking the right balance between complexity of model, and ultimately hypothetical, highly complex model might be able to do this calculation incredibly accurately, but is that at the cost of having to feed it really granular and hard to maintain data sets that it's going to be too much work to maintain. So that's a key part of this work, is working out what level of complexity we need. And we're still doing the analysis on exactly which of the Voll indicators are going to be the most important, and that will be driven by not only which ones are the best predictors of Voll, but also which ones we can easily facilitate including in the model where the data sets are available. However, what we already know from the analysis that has been undertaken is that significant Voll indicators include fuel poverty, EV ownership and rurality, and it's highly likely that any Voll model that results from this work will include those factors. just tabulate the kind of the full set of indicators that we're considering. I'll leave that on board for a minute or so, but you can see that we're looking at open data sources. So the Office of National Statistics provides a lot of demographic data that's particularly useful for doing this kind of analysis. There's also some good data sets from the Centre for Sustainable Energy, notably gas supply, to be social mapping. And then there's the data that you DNOs are able to provide, so on existing outages or consumption of customers. That's probably where we're going to be leaning into yourselves to provide that data, if it is data that's needed for the model. Just to touch on how this model can be used to predict vol in future scenarios. So the key thing to get across here is that the vol model can take any indicators of vol as its input. So the data that you input to the model might represent current demographics, and it might represent current EV penetration. But if you input data to it that represents, for example, a forecast scenario of electric vehicle ownership, then that would be a prediction of vol in that forecasted scenario, so in 10 years, 15 years' time. And it's fairly straightforward to extrapolate a methodology using such a framework where you can calculate the lifetime vol of a particular asset by calculating it at various stages in the future with various predicted future scenarios and integrating it with that data set. I won't dwell on these. There are a number of assumptions that we're currently making in our model. Kind of principal among them is being that we're using the customer survey that's been completed already as our data set. So the methodology that's being used to calculate vol is entirely derived from that, and that's taken as our starting point. So I'm going to move forward now into the detail of how we might implement a model or a tool set that can be used to facilitate a variable disaggregated vol. If anyone has any immediate questions on the approach that's been described, now is the time to take any of those.
So is the intention to exclude commercial and industrial customers altogether, or is it to address them outside of a vol model?
So it's actually one of the points on the assumption slide is currently omitting industrial and commercial customers. There was said there's valid reasons for doing that, and it's not in the scope of our current work to include that. And I'd look to Tracy or Jonathan as to whether.
The assumptions will have to be on the established data, because we didn't actually sample any of the I&C customers.
Yeah, so I suppose that's not necessarily a problem not to have the sample data from the I&C customers. I think you mentioned for a large industrial customer, for a large commercial customer, we'd be able to get a much more accurate understanding of the survey response, possibly to those types of questions, to get a better understanding of what the actual value of lot flows would be. And if we, in that scenario, would it be that you would have a list of customer-specific vols, like we do for line loss factors for larger connected industrial commercial customers, for instance? I don't know whether that be an equivalent alternative where it's calculated on a site-by-site basis, but because clearly there could potentially be some quite large values there that would just stimulate investment. But that's okay. So it's just that was slightly. I know that was slightly to the side of the actual work that's been undertaken.
I think one point probably is worth noting there is that the London Economics study, which did look at I&C customers, reported a much lower value of vol for I&C customers. So that's something like £2,000 per megawatt hour because of the resilience. and that was kind of quoted as one of their main reasons for discounting it.
Right,
It's
okay.
actually a much
So it may be
easier
a lesser
path.
consequence anyway, that's fine, that's okay.
And one of the, just pick up on that, Michael, I think when we sort of raised this initially quite generally, one of the challenges from our UKPN friends was what to do in the circumstance where the ISE customer may well have paid for a very cheap connection. You do a Voll study which says actually the value of this supply to them is very, very high, and therefore do Duos customers therefore have to pay for the quality of the connection that they refused to pay for when they made it in the first place. So I think ISE customers in particular, issues of sort of charging and the security of supply that they paid for initial connection
Could potentially influence whether or not the
also come into play. Because I think with INC, because they've often paid for a bespoke connection offer, I think the question of what do you do with the Voll data when you've got it? Do you do anything different or not? I think is also a factor as well.
Okay, no, that's thank you for that. And then the other question I thought would be quite interesting, more specifically around the actual work that's been undertaken so far is so some of that the intention is to be able to establish which Voll indicators should be the kind of principal drivers in establishing. Is there an intention to undertake any work to understand what kind of penetration of or coverage of percentage of the population for which we know those Voll indicators that would be sufficient to drive a larger group?
As in the availability of the
data sets, essentially. So similar to, I think, some work previously taken by SSE around smart metering data, where it was, for a long time, people said, well, we're not going to be able to use smart metering data until it's ubiquitous, and then I was like, well, that's a bit of a far stretch, but actually if you get 50% smart meter coverage, you can get a pretty good indicator of what the aggregate demand is in a section of the network. And similarly with this, I think it would be unlikely that we get 100% coverage of where our EVs, heat pumps, customer demographics, etc. sit. So at what point can we draw a line and say this is sufficient to extend it to the wider data set? And if that isn't in the scope, I think that could potentially be quite useful.
So what we are exploring is what data sets are available and how the extent of that data. What we're not currently trying to put a number on is how much of an influence that has on the accuracy per se of our model.
Okay.
So I guess the assumption would be if you don't know exactly where every household that has a heat pump, but you've got another data set that's a useful proxy for that, or you've got very good data in a smaller region, and you extrapolate that nationwide. I guess the scope for our work is we can do that extrapolation, but it's based on the assumption that everywhere is the same as Preston or something. And distributing that and making sure everyone is aware of that assumption, and more work needs to be done to map heat pumps because that's a really key factor. Then
we asked for basically use some off-the-shelf indicators, really.
Which I
we
think is the
basically
best way to do
said,
it.
like, there could be a massive barrier to adopting a variable Voll if the thing you need to know is everybody's inside leg measurement in order to calculate it. It just won't fly. So when you're looking for the indicative data sets, the drivers, Fraser Nash, can you use ones that are going to be easy to for other DNOs to frankly lay their hands on?
And in that regard, I think fuel poverty is the knotty one, because I mean EV and it's what solar panels and heat pumps. You should have a view of where they are connected. It's probably a partial view, but it's probably sufficient. Enough of a view. Rurality is it's a pretty fixed factor. It doesn't change. So again, you can identify that through spatial analysis, and once you assign that asset or that area or that zone or that feeder is rural, that's a pretty fixed parameter. But it's the fuel poverty one that I think has caused us some head scratching, because that's a spatial data set, and it does change and move both relatively and absolutely. And slaving that spatial data set to an asset or a network view of the world is actually really quite tricky,
Yeah.
which is what you see what Fraser Nash come on to as sort of ways you might do that. But I
Okay.
think when we've looked at this before, that's the one we've found quite hard.
Yeah, and I think we're probably all undertaking some work where we're trying to align LSOA data sets with network data sets as well, which is kind of
I think we've realised that looks like a key
interface.
nugget to crack.
Yeah,
If
okay.
you can do that, you can bring the worlds of these of spatial data sets with the world of sort of asset and network
And, yeah.
data sets together, which we've never really done before. But no, thanks for
Yeah, no,
You've hit on one of the key challenges for this,
Good.
this work, which is how in detail do you go in the data?
Yeah.
Do you accept a lower fidelity data set with potentially lower accuracy, or do you put the effort in to look at?
Next question. I don't,
Yeah.
know if, I don't know if you've covered this in previous workshops or in documentation. Apologies for that, but this is my first time. Everything's talking about Voll here, but obviously when you're surveying customers, they don't really know what that is. So you'll have somehow had to get them to value their reliability of supply, won't you? And then you've turned it into a value of load. Have you got any of that detail so you can actually see? Because I'm interested in how customers are valuing things. Because as we're looking at this, the overall thing is you've got to, you've got an overall vol of like 17,000 to 50,000.
Yeah.
If nothing else, that's one of the key things to me. Have we got that at the right level, and should it be higher or lower, just in general?
Yeah. So that was the choice-based survey. So imagining getting customers to imagine scenarios and what compensation they would expect to receive in such a scenario. The pair sitting next to you are the best people to go into more detail about that.
Don't answer. Just wondering if you got it, because obviously I'm interested. If you've got two customers two households sat next to each other, one happens to have older, more energy inefficient equipment that's doing 20 kilowatts, and the one next door is 5 kilowatts. Does the one doing 20 have their view worth 4 times as much?
Yeah, and this,
You know what I mean? That-
there's a huge amount of information out there, so I would direct you and I will provide you with all the links to the phase 3 report, the technical appendices that covers that explains in detail that transition of how you actually, on an individual level, model down the individual responses to provide a Voll. But you do hit on a very, very good point. It is those nuanced findings of how do you compare one property to another.
It's important because when we're considering actually grouping and building all the models on top, we have to make sure the building blocks are there first. We can build models of anything, can't we?
Yeah.
And I appreciate what you're saying about multiple combinations and using AI, because you don't have done that based on wrong assumptions, do you? So.
No.
I was going to say, I think the granularity point is a really good one. I think the other question I have when reading through this is how updatable is the data sets? So the chances are the more data sets we use, are they updated at the same sort of time, or are we dealing with inconsistent data sets, which actually, if they're all updated on the 1st of January 2020, we'd end up with one answer, but because they're not, then does that skew? So for me, the regularity of data, how updated it is, and the level of granularity need to be considered at the same sort of time. I think otherwise you end up skewing the message or skewing the output analysis further.
And then from looking at that data and looking at the sort of questions you asked, I was wondering what sort of biases exist in it as a way of actually asking more acute questions afterwards, like such as when someone's just had a fault, ringing them up straight away, like the Ofgem says, how did that feel for you?
Yeah.
Because I was on my drive the other morning, my battery was flat, and I tell you, I was so glad I had breakdown insurance. Because you'd have paid a lot. I'd be thinking, oh my God, I hope I renewed that, because it's probably worth about 200 quid.
Yes.
Well, we collected data on that when the last been used for how many football experiences there
Yeah.
kind of viewers, so we can look at the data by that as well and see what
Which is different to at the time. At the time,
Yeah,
people
but
get emotional, don't they?
Yeah, we do. Yeah.
It's interesting as well, because I don't think it's just necessarily when the individuals accept, again, I've read the Lancaster things in terms of where people have been interviewed. It's like if you look at August the 9th, what happened on August the 9th, people's perception then on the Voll will probably be quite different, even if they weren't necessarily affected on August the 9th to what it was on August the 8th. And those sort of things are quite interesting as well, in terms of, again, how do you factor those things in? Yeah, and again, all this is about assumptions, so I'm quite interested about how you think about Voll going forwards, about assumptions on EVs, smart metering, all of those sort of things which are both outside networks control, almost outside customers' control to an extent, and very much led by government policy, how those sort of things then can interact with the model as well, and how key they are to assumptions going forward.
So that's where the link between us and impact research is key. So I'll move on if that's all right. So there's a couple of key questions that I don't think we'll get to an answer on today, but we want to stimulate exactly the kind of discussion that we started having. The first of which is geographic fidelity, so how you identify your sample population for which you want to identify the Voll value for. Is it the customer's connected to a particular asset, or is it satisfactory to look at a particular geographic area and make an assumption about where customers are connected to? And the second one is the data granularity, so how detailed should the Voll indicator data be, both at a geographic level and how often is that updated, how often does it need to be updated. So what I'm going to present next is 7 different options, for 5 for the first question, 2 for the second question, on geographic and data granularity respectively. So these aren't necessarily the only solutions, it's just to stimulate some initial thoughts. And if people have other ideas, then in the discussion afterwards, then please do put them on the table. What we think is a sensible way to proceed on this is to consider a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats analysis for each option. So you should have some handouts in front of you, and if you want to make some notes as I'm going through the slides, then have that as a reference for the open discussion later. Critical success factors. Obviously, before you decide what the best option is going to be going forward, we need to know what the drivers of success are going to be. Drafted some initial success factors for such a kind of hypothetical model here. There may be additional ones, and if anyone does have any additional thoughts on what is important for this model, then now's the opportunity to let us know. I think the first one, solution accuracy. So how accurately is the solution able to calculate Voll? Solution practicality. So how practical is the solution for integration with the current regulatory framework and investment decision models? So exactly the work that Jonathan was going through. Implementation practicality. How practical is it to collect the necessary data and implement the solution? So some of the challenges we've already started discussing, and cost, which is tied into the implementation practicality as well. And as we're going through this, I think questions to consider: what are the implications of this approach for CBA, CNAME, IAS? What do you think is an appropriate level of granularity for the data sets? How would one access such a tool or model? How would it be distributed? So does it want to be a web application where you can log on and provide input data and get an answer? Is it a database? Is it a spreadsheet? Various levels of complexity possible here. You may have a view on the data sets that have already been presented as we go through the data sets that we'll discuss. So how available do you understand the data sets to be, particularly the DNO data sets, so history of interruptions, consumption values. Particularly interested to hear how your thoughts on that. How could you foresee a model being used to forecast future distribution scenarios? And is there anything additional that we want to discuss? So, first option. We've already discussed lower super output area. So these are fixed geographic areas with around 1,500 residents in each one, unlike postcodes, which have varying degrees of numbers of households in them, and electoral regions which do change. These were developed by the ONS for the 1990 census, I believe, and they've become increasingly ubiquitous for geographic data in the UK. A lot of open source data sets are released on an LSOA basis. See on the right the LSOA data for Bristol, which is where 3 of us are from. you can see that in an urban area it does provide quite a high degree of geographic granularity, but the areas get much larger as you move into rural areas. So a simple solution would be for Fraser Nash or whoever produces a final Voll model to use the survey data and the approach that's been discussed, calculate the Voll indicators for each LSOA around the UK, feed that into the model, calculate a Voll for each LSOA, and then release that as a data set. So you'd end up with essentially a spreadsheet with several tens of thousands of lines on it, but you could use to look up this. I want to know the Voll for this particular geographic area, and it would be a straight look up to know the Voll for that LSOA. The challenges around that are, I think, fairly obvious in that you're not looking to calculate Voll for an LSOA. That's not the problem that you're trying to solve here. You're trying to calculate Voll for all manner of different customer sets, and they're unlikely to map directly to LSOA. But I think this approach would give the flexibility to aggregate in a number of different flexible ways and could be easily distributed, whilst not necessarily representing potentially a substation that sits right on the boundary of 3 different LSOAs. You're not necessarily going to get the most accurate figure than if you went down to a lower level of detail.
So, Robbie, given that the size of the LSOAs are, for all intents and purposes, the same,
Yes.
is it relatively straightforward to build them into different constructs? You don't have to have any complex weighting. If you wanted, for example, a Voll for Bristol,
Yeah.
or a Voll for North Bristol and South Bristol, or
Yes.
different level, are they? Presumably it's very straightforward.
Yeah, very straightforward. Just aggregate that up. Yeah.
Because they're all assumed to be equally weighted.
Exactly. Yeah. It'd be a straight average. Very easy to aggregate up to larger geographic areas, harder to aggregate down to smaller geographic areas or geographic areas that don't exactly match to the existing boundaries. So the next option is Voll estimates could be provided for any household that sits within an area defined by a point of radius. So you could imagine, rather than a spreadsheet, this time it's some kind of application where you can click on a geographic point, set a radius, and ask the model to calculate a Voll for that region, or potentially in a slightly more controlled way, enter a latitude, a longitude, and a radius, potentially for a particular asset, and have the tool calculate the Voll for you. This obviously has more flexibility than the rigidly defined LSOAs, but you're still making an assumption about trying to map the area of influence of an asset to a fixed geographic area. So better in some ways, perhaps worse in others. A third option, which is very similar, is that you don't necessarily need to constrain yourself to having a circle geographic area. You could define your own polygon, so essentially define your own shape of LSOA region, and have a tool calculate Voll for that region instead. Again, this would need to be some kind of common application that's shared between all different parties that would want to use it, and gives you that much more flexibility, but still makes the same assumption that you're interested in a fixed geographic area as opposed to perhaps a list of households that are served by a particular asset.
Robbie, you know, it's a list of households. To actually do the free-form polygons, you're going to have to do that from the households within it, aren't you?
So this is where the distinction comes in from the input data, needing to be for at a household level and the level of granularity that Voll is reported at. So yes, if you want to do it on a freeform polygon, the best way to do that would be to know the Voll for all the individual households within that. But you could also do an aggregation based on the perhaps LSOA level data for your freeform polygon, where it crosses boundaries, and make assumptions about perhaps the area shared between the different LSOAs.
But
So-
if your freeform polygon was smaller than LSLA, you already said you can't disaggregate it, didn't you?
Yeah, so it'd just be
Yes,
equal to
yeah.
that
Yeah,
one
you've got to
LSA.
build it up.
It would be the same as that one LSA.
Yes.
But if you were to cross, if your freeform polygon crossed two LSOAs, with 40% in one and 60% in the other,
Yeah.
it would take a 60%, 40% split across those two LSOAs.
So this is the point I'm going to come on to in this slide, but you see exactly there, that's a freeform polygon or a circle. If it crosses LSOA boundaries, then you need to make assumptions. I'll come on to this in more detail. I've got a couple of slides on that exact problem.
So just thinking that, because if you've got it at individual households, you could do it by substation feeding zone, however you want.
Yeah, exactly.
And then aggregate that up on a network basis rather than geographic basis to get circuits.
Yeah.
It's almost that you need a suite of different layers, we call them, for the best description. So if you start at number 23 High Street, then you go to the then you go to the distribution feeder, then you go to the substation, then you go to the HV, then you go to the primary. You could actually have different values for different areas of the network, but you need to have some sort of polygon style modelling at the higher levels to actually achieve that. But then you do run into this averaging problem.
I mean, but it's just, let the art of the perfect be the destroyer of the better. Because at the minute we have an enormous averaging problem in one sense, and what we are now presenting is an opportunity to have much less of a problem and target our actions to the specific benefits on a polygon, a circle, whatever it is, the shape that we define, and it's exactly to the point of how much flexibility there is in defining the area that you calculate the Voll on is definitely a factor of what level you've got all the data at. And there's, like, in a sense, I'm going to say it's dead easy to have one national value at the minute. We've already got that. And we're just trying to explore how much further you go, because it could be at a household level, but then you'd need to know probably the attributes at a household level. It could be at an LSOA level where we think there's quite a bit of data already available, so that might be a compromise. It might be that there's a common thread of network level data, I don't know, primary substations, where we all know, because DNO is the data, relevant data about each of the customers, and so we can aggregate on that level. That's, I think, one of the key things we're trying to smoke out of today is what's the right level of this aggregation.
And you've perfectly summarised both sides of the argument. So thank you. So yeah, we've touched on we've started to touch on these points already, but to go to the lower extreme of the geographic fidelity is to make estimates of Voll for individual households, perhaps by providing a list of NPAN numbers to a tool. Estimates of Voll indicators can then be made directly for each household. It's a slightly independent question as to where those estimates of the Voll indicators come from, because if they in themselves are based on LSOA data, then you're not actually doing much better. But if you do have more granular data sets, perhaps not even all the data sets, but if some of your data sets are more granular, then you do gain an advantage in the model accuracy by going for such an approach. And yeah, it gives you the ultimate flexibility to define the exact set of households that you're wanting to calculate vol for. Perhaps at the cost of giving yourselves too much option, and then how do you combine those list of households in the first place? That's not a trivial question. So the fifth option, which is perhaps something that could be expanded upon further, is to look at the problem not by geographic area from which kind of the ultimate is going to a single point, but to look at it as a network problem instead. And Bob said to look at it at different levels of the network. There's definitely a question of if you take this approach, what level of the network you apply it to. You could foresee a national database of assets with a vol for each one. Now, it's not going to be trivial to do that, because it may require lots of cooperation between yourselves in terms of sharing data sets in order to come up with these estimates in using a common methodology. However, once it is implemented, it then becomes probably the most straightforward methodology to use, because if you're looking at a vol for a particular substation or HV feeder, it's just a case of looking it up in the database. So more work up front, perhaps the easiest of all the options to use at the end. So that's kind of the first set of problems, which is how do you come up with your sample population that you want to calculate vol for. So we might not have covered all the options there, but I think we've covered a reasonably broad range of different bases. The second question is how granular do you go with your data sets? And as I've already touched on, some of the options that we presented don't present a huge amount of additional value unless you do go down to having lower level data feeding it. So I guess the highest level option is to input the data to the model at an LSOA level. You could put it even higher level than that. You could have a medium super output area, which is about 5 times as large as a low super output area. We'll go to a local authority level. For the data sets we need, most of that data is provided at an LSOA level, so it's not a huge effort to go down to that level. To go further represents, I think that's the cut-off where it represents a much more significant investment in effort to implement. The problem, as has already been touched upon with going for this approach, is that it's unlikely that your sample population is going to correlate directly with an LSOA. And so, for example, in this case here, if you were trying to estimate the proportion of fuel-poor households, one of our most likely vol indicators, in the region defined by the green circle up here, you would have to go through perhaps a weighted average process by the different LSOAs that are covered by that region. So you might know that the proportion of fuel-poor households is 6%, 18%, 14% in the different LSOAs respectively, and that the radius you've defined falls 50% in LSOA A and 30% and 20% in B and C, and then you could do a weighted average, which, although your individual vols for the your individual values for the number of proportion of fuel-poor households in the region is 6%, 18%, and 14%. You come up with a weighted average value that, on average in this area, we think it's 11.2%. It's an estimate, it's an assumption, and I think understanding that is key to the future kind of discussions. It's how much accuracy are you losing by making those assumptions, kind of bearing in mind that there are a lot of assumptions already in the model, and so is it worth going right down into detail and getting perfect fuel-poor data when say it's ultimately based on a customer survey of choice preferences that has an inherent accuracy in itself. So it may be sufficiently accurate and practical for the purposes of the Voll model. That's a key discussion point for what comes next. And then going down at the other end of the spectrum, trying to get estimates of the Voll indicators at a household level, or just a more granular level than LSOA, so that could be output area, which is about 150 households, I think. Postcode, or down to household level. Considerations here is that whilst these kind of data sets aren't necessarily available as open source data sets, some of them can be bought. So a particular example of that is the Experian Mosaic data set, which provide demographic data across the UK that's been aggregated across lots of different data sources. Don't have the implications of subscriptions to that data set. For other data sets, particularly around electricity consumption, supply reliability, be reliant on DNOs cooperating and providing that data for us as input to the model and agreeing on a common framework for doing that. So the practicality of obtaining these data sets is, and I think one of the key things we should be discussing after lunch probably now, as well as the extra utility that you get from putting in that extra effort. And I think as someone's already said, it's a key thing to consider is the overhead in keeping these data sets up to date.